August 6, 1942. The aircraft carrier Shokaku lay anchored in Truck Lagoon, its flight deck barren, its hangar bays still. Below deck, in a cramped conference room heavy with cigarette smoke, 5 Japanese naval officers gathered around a table littered with maps, casualty reports, and intelligence summaries. They had conferred for 3 hours. No one had uttered a word for the past 10 minutes. Finally, Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi shattered the quiet. "Gentlemen, we must confront what these figures reveal. The war is lost." The room stayed silent. No one challenged him. None needed to. They all understood. August 6, 1942 marked precisely 2 months since the Battle of Midway, and the consequences were at last becoming inescapable. Japan had forfeited the war's momentum, perhaps irrevocably. And the profound irony was that Pearl Harbor, the assault intended to cripple American naval power, had instead sealed Japan's eventual downfall. To comprehend how these admirals arrived at this crushing realization, we must journey back 8 months to December 7, 1941. That morning, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's meticulously orchestrated strike achieved tactical brilliance. Japanese aircraft sank or damaged 8 American battleships. They obliterated 188 aircraft. They killed 2,403 Americans. The operation unfolded nearly flawlessly. Almost. The critical oversights became instantly evident to those observing closely. The American aircraft carriers were absent from port. Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga were at sea, unscathed. The massive fuel depots at Pearl Harbor holding millions of gallons of oil went untouched. The submarine base was disregarded. The repair facilities stood undamaged. Yamamoto himself reportedly remarked after the attack, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Many historians contest whether Yamamoto voiced those precise words. But Japanese naval intelligence documents from early 1942 indicated Japan's senior admirals recognized they possessed a fleeting window of opportunity. Intelligence assessments projected Japan had 6 to 8 months before American industrial output would begin to overwhelm Japanese advantages in training, experience, and positioning. 8 months. By August 1942, that window had shut. The Battle of Midway in early June 1942 was the catastrophic turning point. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These were not mere vessels. They were irreplaceable combat platforms manned by irreplaceable pilots. Japan entered the conflict with 10 fleet carriers. By August 1942, they retained 6, and 2 of those sustained damage. The United States, conversely, was constructing carriers at a pace that staggered Japanese naval planners. In that conference room on August 6, the admirals examined intelligence reports exposing the true magnitude of the disaster. American shipyards had over a dozen fleet carriers under construction. Essex-class carriers larger and more advanced than anything Japan could produce. The first would commission in early 1943. By 1944, the United States would wield numerical superiority so crushing that Japanese defensive strategy would become untenable. But the carrier figures were merely the start. The intelligence reports detailed American aircraft production. In 1941, American factories manufactured approximately 19,000 military aircraft. Japanese factories produced about 5,000, yet the disparity was expanding exponentially. American output was accelerating while Japanese production struggled merely to sustain current levels. By 1943, intelligence estimates projected the United States would manufacture 85,000 aircraft annually. Japan might produce 16,000 if everything proceeded optimally. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the air assault on Pearl Harbor, attended this August meeting. He had been wounded at Midway and was convalescing, but his tactical acumen was required for planning. Fuchida presented an analysis that shattered morale. Japanese naval aviation had commenced the war with roughly 3,500 highly trained carrier pilots. These men had trained for years. They were arguably the finest carrier pilots globally in December 1941. By August 1942, approximately 40% of them were dead, killed at Coral Sea, Midway, and in the relentless attrition of the Solomon Islands campaign. The survivors were exhausted, flying multiple missions daily with insufficient rest. Meanwhile, Japanese pilot training programs were generating perhaps 100 new carrier-qualified pilots monthly. And these new pilots possessed perhaps 200 hours of flight time compared to the 800-plus hours the veterans had accumulated pre-war. American pilot training told a contrasting story. The United States was training thousands of pilots monthly. Their instruction wasn't as rigorous initially, but the sheer volume meant American losses could be replaced swiftly. Japanese losses could not. Every season Japanese pilot lost was effectively irreplaceable. Fuchida calculated that at current attrition rates, Japan would exhaust its experienced carrier pilots by mid-1943, irrespective of carrier numbers. The submarine warfare statistics were equally bleak. Japanese submarines had achieved minimal success despite sophisticated designs. They were utilized primarily for fleet support rather than commerce raiding. Meanwhile, American submarines were beginning to strangle Japanese merchant shipping. Japan's economy relied entirely on imports. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina, iron or from multiple sources. All required shipment through waters increasingly dominated by American submarines. Admiral Yamaguchi presented shipping loss data. In January 1942, Japan lost 15 merchant ships. By June, they were losing 30 ships monthly. By August, the rate had climbed to 40 ships monthly. The trajectory was alarming. At this pace, by 1944, Japan would lack sufficient merchant shipping to sustain basic economic function, let alone support military operations. And Japan's shipbuilding capacity couldn't compensate. They could construct perhaps 200,000 tons of merchant shipping yearly. They were losing 300,000 tons annually, and the losses were accelerating. The strategic landscape was equally desperate. Japan had conquered vast territories in 6 months. The Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, and numerous Pacific islands. This expansion created a defensive perimeter thousands of miles long. Defending it necessitated dispersing Japanese forces across dozens of garrisons, many in isolated locations difficult to supply and impossible to reinforce rapidly. The Americans, by contrast, could concentrate their forces. They could select where and when to attack. Japan had to defend everywhere. This fundamental asymmetry meant that even with equivalent forces, the Americans held the advantage. But forces weren't equal. American strength was expanding. Japanese strength was diminishing. The mathematics were inescapable. One admiral broached the possibility of negotiated peace. Perhaps if Japan proposed returning some conquered territories, the United States might accept a ceasefire. The suggestion was met with bitter laughter. The admirals had all reviewed intelligence summaries of American public sentiment. Pearl Harbor had enraged the American populace in ways Japanese planners hadn't foreseen. The attack, intended to demoralize America into negotiating, had instead forged absolute determination to annihilate Japan completely. American bonds were oversubscribed. Factories operated 3 shifts. Women joined the workforce in unprecedented numbers. There would be no negotiated peace. America demanded unconditional surrender. The discussion shifted to what had gone wrong. The Pearl Harbor attack had attained its tactical goals, but strategically it had been calamitous. Why? Admiral Chuchi Nagumo, who had commanded the carrier strike force at Pearl Harbor, offered his viewpoint. The attack had been designed to destroy American battleship strength, granting Japan 6 months to consolidate its conquests before America could retaliate. The theory posited that after 6 months of defeats, American public opinion would compel the government to negotiate. This theory proved fundamentally flawed. First, battleships weren't the decisive weapon. Carriers were. By missing the American carriers at Pearl Harbor, Japan had left America's most critical naval assets unharmed. Second, American public psychology had been entirely misjudged. The attack had unified American opinion as nothing else could. Third, Pearl Harbor had granted America the moral high ground internationally, facilitating alliance building and resource acquisition. Fourth, and perhaps most crucially, the attack had been too successful in one specific aspect. It resembled treachery. Japanese diplomats were meant to deliver a declaration of war 30 minutes before the attack commenced. Due to decoding delays, the declaration arrived after the attack began. This made Pearl Harbor appear as a sneak attack, a breach of international norms. American propaganda branded it a day of infamy, and that label endured. Japan had furnished America a perfect rallying cry. Admiral Yamaguchi produced another document that rendered the situation even bleaker. It was an analysis of the Doolittle raid from April 1942. 16 American B-25 bombers had launched from the carrier Hornet and bombed Tokyo and other Japanese cities. The physical damage was minimal. A few buildings destroyed, a handful of casualties. Militarily insignificant, but strategically the raid had devastated Japan. It shattered the myth of homeland invulnerability. It demonstrated that American carriers could approach Japan itself. It compelled Japan to retain aircraft and troops in the home islands for defense, resources desperately needed elsewhere. Most importantly, it had prompted the Japanese High Command to accelerate plans for the Midway operation, the operation that culminated in catastrophic defeat. The Midway operation itself warranted scrutiny. The plan had been intricate, involving multiple forces approaching from different directions intended to confuse and overwhelm American defenders. Instead, the complexity had fostered coordination issues. The Japanese forces were dispersed, unable to support one another. Meanwhile, American codebreakers had deciphered Japanese communications and knew precisely where and when the attack would occur. This raised another critical failure: intelligence and security. Japanese naval codes were being read by the Americans. Japanese officers didn't grasp the full extent of the compromise, but they knew enough to be profoundly alarmed. Every operation plan, every ship movement, every strategic intention was potentially known to the enemy before implementation. Fighting a war when your adversary can read your orders is nearly impossible. The meeting explored alternatives that might have succeeded better than Pearl Harbor. What if Japan hadn't attacked the United States at all? What if they had only attacked British and Dutch colonial possessions in Southeast Asia? Would America have entered the war? The consensus was uncertain. President Roosevelt clearly desired entering the war against Germany and Japan, but American public opinion in 1941 was deeply isolationist. Without Pearl Harbor, would Congress have declared war? Possibly not immediately. Japan might have gained months or even years to consolidate its conquests without American opposition. Instead, Pearl Harbor had provided Roosevelt precisely what he required: a united nation demanding war. Another alternative: what if the Pearl Harbor attack had been more comprehensive? What if Nagumo had launched a third wave to destroy the fuel depots, repair facilities, and submarine base? Some officers had advocated this at the time. Nagumo had declined, concerned about American counterattacks and wishing to preserve his forces. In retrospect, this caution appeared a fatal error. Destroying those facilities might have delayed American Pacific operations by 6 months or more. 6 months Japan desperately needed. But the admirals acknowledged an uncomfortable truth. Even a more thorough Pearl Harbor assault wouldn't have altered the ultimate outcome. The fundamental problem wasn't tactical execution. It was strategic reality. Japan's economy was a fraction of America's size. Japan's industrial capacity was perhaps 1/10 of America's. Japan's oil production was virtually zero without imports. Japan's population was less than half of America's. In a protracted war of attrition, these disparities ensured defeat. Yamamoto had understood this from the outset. He had opposed war with the United States, arguing Japan couldn't win. He had been overruled by army leaders and civilian government officials who believed American democracy was weak and decadent, that Americans lacked the will to fight a long war, that a rapid series of victories would force American capitulation. Every one of these assumptions was proving catastrophically erroneous. Captain Fuchida presented the most disheartening analysis of all: the oil situation. Japan's entire strategic calculus had centered on securing oil from the Dutch East Indies. American embargoes had threatened to strangle Japan's economy and military. Seizing the Indonesian oil fields was intended to resolve this issue, and Japan had succeeded in capturing those fields largely intact. But success created new problems. The oil required transport to Japan. Tankers had to traverse waters increasingly swarming with American submarines. In January 1942, Japan had imported 400,000 tons of oil from the Indies. By August, imports had fallen to 250,000 tons. The trend was evident. By 1943, submarine warfare might reduce oil imports to levels inadequate to sustain military operations. Japan would possess oil fields, but no means to convey the oil home. The admirals debated whether any path to victory remained. Perhaps if Japan could inflict sufficient casualties on American forces, making the cost of advancing so exorbitant that American public opinion turned against the war. This hope was systematically dismantled by intelligence assessments. American casualty tolerance appeared far higher than Japanese planners had anticipated. The Bataan Death March and reports of Japanese treatment of prisoners had infuriated American opinion, making the war personal. Americans weren't calculating costs and benefits. They sought vengeance. They demanded total victory. Casualty lists that might have deterred other nations seemed only to fortify American resolve. Moreover, American tactics were evolving to minimize casualties. American forces weren't engaging in suicidal banzai charges. They were employing overwhelming firepower, air superiority, and material advantages to erode Japanese positions while conserving their own losses. The Americans were waging an industrial war, treating it as a production problem solvable through superior resources and logistics. The meeting examined the current situation in the Solomon Islands, where American forces had landed on Guadalcanal in early August. Japanese forces were fighting desperately to expel them. But the admirals recognized Guadalcanal represented a new American strategy. Seizing forward bases, constructing airfields, utilizing those airfields to dominate surrounding regions, then advancing to the next objective. It was methodical, relentless, and effective. Japan couldn't match this approach. Japanese logistics were insufficient. Japanese industrial production couldn't provide enough aircraft, ships, and supplies to match American reinforcement rates. Every engagement was becoming a battle of attrition, and Japan was losing the attrition calculus at every echelon. One final document was reviewed, an economic analysis prepared by the Finance Ministry. It projected Japanese economic capacity through 1945 under various scenarios. Even the most optimistic scenarios indicated collapse by late 1944. Japan's economy simply couldn't sustain the war effort beyond 3 years total. They were now 8 months into the conflict. The clock was ticking. The admirals reached their devastating conclusion. Pearl Harbor had been a tactical success, but a strategic catastrophe of the highest order. It had achieved nothing Japan required while unifying and enraging the one adversary Japan absolutely needed to avoid confronting. The war was now unwinnable. The sole question was how much devastation Japan would endure before accepting the inevitable. Admiral Yamaguchi proposed recommending to higher command that Japan pursue peace negotiations immediately before conditions deteriorated further. The proposal was rejected not because the admirals disputed the analysis, but because they knew such recommendations would be dismissed or worse, branded as defeatism and treason. The military government wasn't interested in reality. They were committed to fighting to the bitter end. The meeting concluded with no decisions, no recommendations, merely a shared understanding of the truth. Japan had lost the war on December 7, 1941. The realization had simply not yet dawned. The admirals filed out, returning to their duties, planning operations they knew couldn't succeed, fighting a war they knew was lost. August 6, 1942. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe and comment your suggestion.